We have entitled our talk, CSCL Gets to Work, Towards Collaborative Learning in the Workplace. Now, although all of the studies that we will talk about in this particular talk are all in a formal learning setting, the goal of the series of studies is to learn how to inject effective collaborative learning experiences into the workplace. And so we're going to focus ultimately on software teams, because the idea is that we were developing a paradigm that might be used in an industry context with software development teams. Now, actually, the problem that we are thinking about solving in order to make that possible is also a problem in project courses. And so it actually makes this dovetailing of the studies which we're currently running and our long-term goal makes sense. And in particular, anyone who's ever taught a project course knows that although the goal of the instructors is for students to come to those experiences and revisit what they've learned in other courses in a new way, now applying them, now learning them more deeply, what ends up happening is that the reward structures encourage students really to take more of a productivity focus, and that undercuts their learning. They end up distributing work in ways that encourage students to do things that they're already good at so that they produce a good project that gets a good grade. And we see this as being very similar to the reward structures in industry, where actually it's almost entirely a productivity focus. We need to get work done in order for the company to be viable. And yet, it's important in this day where technology is changing so fast and retraining and keeping up with change is so important that we have to think about how it is that people can keep up somehow. And training experiences that take people away from work end up being shortchanged when push comes to shove. And so we believe that a better way to make this possible in the future would be to embed learning experiences during work. And in particular, we see this as a great opportunity for what we have accomplished as a field in CSCL to influence the workplace. So the goal is in this work to explore how it is that team formation strategies themselves set up teams to be conducive to learning. So although this may not be the sum total of what it would take to meet our goal, it is one important characteristic of the environment that people find themselves in, and it is something that managers have some control over. So if we had insight into how to assign people to working groups, perhaps for short-term assignments, we would be able to use that decision-making as a way of balancing the productivity and the learning goals. So getting the job done, but keeping our workers up with the changing landscape of work. Ultimately, though, you'll see as we get closer to the end of this talk, we're going to introduce a new paradigm for scaffolding the actual work, and this comes from the emerging industry practice called mob programming. And here we see a way that group work is structured that also acts as a scaffold, and we'll think about the interplay between the team assignment and those roles. So we're going to use as the basis for our proposed team assignment approach a construct which many of you will be familiar with called transactivity. And we're going to talk about both its social and its cognitive underpinnings, and you'll see why considering these together is really important when we're talking about team formation. So then we'll introduce how this factors in to an approach to automated team assignment. And then we'll explore how it might be applied to software teams, and we'll talk about two specific studies. And actually, the important thing here is that although while we're introducing the paradigm, we'll talk about some validation studies that support the value of this proposed team formation strategy in terms of setting up teams to learn and produce well together, that actually there are some factors that can challenge whether we see those positive effects in specific environments. So in the first case, we'll talk about a project course where the teachers don't force teams to take assignments of themselves to teams, but they can take it if they choose. And will it be enough to provide good recommendations for teams if the students have a choice? And we'll see that actually that does raise many challenges. And the second one is about when we introduce additional scaffolding for group processes, do we still see the positive effects? Are they still necessary? Or can we scaffold the processes that the implicit scaffolding of the team assignment accomplishes in a separate, more explicit way, and therefore remove the need for the implicit scaffolding? So we'll look at that too. And then we'll conclude. Okay, so let's start out by talking about transactivity. So transactivity, if you think about it in its most simple formulation, is about the reasoning of one expressed in one utterance building on the reasoning expressed in another utterance. And usually when we think about this in CSCL, we think about what are called other-oriented transacts, where one student builds on the reasoning of another student. And the reason why this is important is because in collaborative learning, we want students to learn from working together. And we see these opportunities for students to reflect on how their mental models are different from those of their partner students when they're engaging in this transactive conversational behavior. So here's an example. One student, and this is from an environmental sciences unit, where students are working together on power plans for cities. And one student is talking about coal as a potential power source. And another student kind of agrees with them, but talks about some different ways that the first student might think about it. What are some things that they might not have considered? So it's a challenge. It agrees and disagrees. And so it's a time of reflection for the students together. So it meets our requirements. It refers to the previous utterance, and it builds on it with its own original reasoning. Now, transactivity is not an idea that we're proposing. Rather, it is a construct that has been explored in prior work in learning sciences. It actually grows out of a Piagetian learning paradigm originally and connects with the idea of cognitive conflict. In fact, it's been referred to as socio-cognitive conflict because it's kind of a visible representation that a student might be engaging in cognitive conflict, or that the situation for triggering a cognitive conflict might be happening in the interaction. But you don't have to adopt a Piagetian stance on your understanding of how learning works. Actually, the construct of transactivity has come up under different names and in virtually every theory of learning. So for example, let's take the Vygotskian learning paradigm. And here we can see that you might look at these transactive utterances as places where students are offering scaffolding for another student's articulation of reasoning. So now we're just kind of recasting what's happening in these transactive utterances, but within a different learning paradigm. And in virtually every learning paradigm, something like transactivity is valued as a kind of conversational behavior that students engage in, and when they do, it's seen as a good collaboration or an opportunity for learning. And in fact, high transactivity groups have been associated in prior work with higher learning, higher knowledge transfer, better knowledge integration, and more effective problem solving. Now, most of that focuses on learning from a cognitive perspective, but there's a social side of this. And even if you go back to the Piagetian roots, you can see this in that Piaget talked about power balance between a student and their surroundings as being an important precondition for cognitive conflict. And within a social encounter where that environment is the other student, the power balance has to do with kind of the relationship between those two students. And you could see it as, a predisposition of the students to build common ground with one another. They respect their own ideas, but they also respect the ideas of others. Now, you would expect then to see evidence of a correlation between the occurrence of these transactive utterances and evidence of social processes that are related to this idea of power balance and mutual respect and common ground building. And from a sociolinguistic perspective, that would lead you to expect to see a relationship between the concentration of transactive utterances and the level of sociolinguistic speech style accommodation that you might see if you looked at the audio signal of two students working together. And in fact, in Ka-Jin Kwan's prior work published in the IJCSCL, she found exactly this, that a measure of speech style accommodation from the audio signal of pairs of students engaging with one another in a debate predicted the concentration of transactive utterances, specifically other-oriented transactive utterances in the transcripts of those collaborative encounters. And that just highlights this deep connection between the cognitive side of transactivity and its social underpinnings. If we were using it then as a basis for team assignment, we might think in terms of those social underpinnings, that when we see transactive exchange, it indexes something relational that might mean that a pair of students are predisposed to collaborate well together because they have the preconditions for engaging in transactive exchange. So we've observed the transactive exchange, we think there must be something behind it, so then we think that it might persist. So in a previous piece of work, this was led by Miao Wen in her dissertation research, we see that we can actually make an estimate of collaboration potential between pairs of students by measuring their transactive exchange first in a public setting. So the way this worked in an online course, students came into the course, they did some individual work, they posted their individual work to a public discussion forum. They were asked to offer feedback to 2 or 3 other students. We did an automated analysis of all of those exchanges, used our automated measure of transactivity to estimate pairwise collaboration potential between each pair of students who participated in the discussion forum. And then we used a constraint satisfaction algorithm to construct teams out of the whole class, such that the way of grouping students into teams maximized the extent to which students were placed with the other students that they had engaged transactively with. So note that every student was assigned to a team because the idea is that students engage in transactive behavior differentially depending upon their level of respect for and interest in other students. And so if we maximize the extent to which students are placed with those students who they've engaged transactively with, then we create groups in which the people who are working together have that kind of relationship. And in a controlled experiment where we used this paradigm with batches of students, where either a batch of students, which would be like a whole class, we would assign all the teams in that class through this transactivity maximization, or in another class they went through the same process, but we just didn't use the measure of transactive potential or collaborative potential to assign them to teams. Instead, we assigned the teams randomly. We found that the batches where we used the transactivity-based team assignment performed better. And then we tested the generalization of this effect in an actual MOOC and found correlational evidence that the same effect held in this more realistic context. The controlled study was a lab study where we used a simulated course. So now we take this paradigm, which has been validated both in a lab study and in an actual MOOC, and now we're going to use it in a large university level course. So this is a full semester long course, 16 weeks. The topic is cloud computing, and the students are engaged in collaborative software development together. It's mostly graduate students, but there are undergraduate students as well. And this is an online course from 3 CMU campuses, Pittsburgh, Silicon Valley, and Rwanda. We have a diversity of backgrounds and experiences. in this course, and what really challenges actually the generality of the approach, even though it's been validated in studies in the past, is that in this case, team assignment is framed as optional. So we used exactly the same paradigm that had been used in Miao Miao Wen's work. We built 35 three-person teams using this approach. What we did was we assigned, so like the MOOC, we assigned all of the teams using this transactivity-based team assignment, and then gave everyone the recommendations. But only 5 out of the 27 teams even partly took up the recommendation. And what we found is that as soon as a few teams chose not to take the recommendation, the entire structure broke down, because as those students chose to work with other students who had been assigned to other teams, those teams broke down, and then they had to pick other students. And pretty soon, more or less, the whole class went off to their own assignments. So that was one of the problems. If the students are not required to take the recommendation, it might be the best recommendation in the world, and yet it won't have any positive impact because the students won't have taken it up. Now, we checked then as a post hoc analysis to find out, is there any evidence that students would have done better or if they had taken our recommendation? So one thing we were able to do is for all of the teams that ended up forming, we computed what their the average pairwise transactivity score was that would have been computed for that team, because we thought, well, our constraint satisfaction algorithm assigned them to different teams, but maybe they actually placed themselves in teams that would have gotten as high a score on our criterion measure anyway. We did find that the level of transactivity measured as potential for the team before their teamwork did have a positive correlation with their the auto portion of the grade that they achieved from the work that they did together. So that was a partial validation that transactivity is a good thing. But what we did find was that the criterion score for the teams that we auto created were significantly higher than the criterion scores computed for the teams post hoc, the teams that the students chose. So they did not choose to put themselves in teams that rated high on our criterion measure. What students mostly did do to form their teams was to pick people who they were friends with. And actually, not all of the teams did this, but the ones who did actually performed the worst out of all of the strategies that we found in a post survey that students used. Other things that students did to assign themselves to teams was to observe that some students seemed to be very dedicated to the course and had good group work practices. And those students who picked their team based on those kinds of observations were equally satisfied and performed well in their teams, as good as those that were high on transactivity. And then also the teams that chose to take our recommendation were also among the highest performing teams. But again, the issue here is that though we have some validation that our team assignment strategy itself was positive, it didn't in fact have positive impact in this class because many students chose not to take the recommendation. It just shows that the AI is not enough. It's not enough to have a good algorithm. The best recommendation only has impact if it's taken up. Okay, so now let's turn to a second study, and here, again, we challenge whether the fact that we have some validation that this is a good team assignment strategy is enough to recommend that we use it in a different context. And so here we are contrasting the notion of team assignment as potentially an implicit scaffolding for collaborative processes with the kind of more typical notion of scaffolding where we offer explicit structuring of the group work. And in this particular case, it's going to be using this mob programming paradigm that I mentioned earlier in my talk. And I'd like to point out that this contrast between explicit and implicit support for collaboration has been previously explored in Xu Wang's CSCL paper from 2017, where she did a 2x2 factorial design contrasting whether explicit support for collaborative processes was offered and whether this implicit support of team formation was offered. And what she found is that they behaved synergistically with one another, and that that in order to achieve a positive effect in her context, she needed both. But here, we're going to look at it in a slightly different way. In our case, all of the teams will have the explicit scaffolding, and it's a stronger intervention in terms of that explicit scaffolding than what Xu Wang used in her particular study. And what we're going to be testing is whether in that case we still see that the setting up of a predisposition for teams to perform well together using the transactivity matching is even necessary anymore. So let's start by talking about the scaffolding itself. So we're talking about this industry paradigm called mob programming. There are 4 different roles: a driver, a navigator, a mob position, and a facilitator position. And this is kind of an extension of what you may have heard about before called pair programming. In pair programming, you've got a driver who's actually doing the programming and a navigator who's kind of directing that process, and then they rotate roles. And a goal is that they see that software development process from 2 different perspectives. And there's been a huge amount of work about this. The person who invented it at NC State just recently got a big award for this work. In mob programming, we extend this. The mob role, and there can be many people playing this role, is to kind of offer some reflection, to inject other perspectives into the mix. It really could be lots of different supporting kind of work. For example, people in the mob might be going off and trying ideas before they're taken up by the driver. They might be looking up some background information that the driver and navigator don't have time to refer to. The facilitator can be seen as potentially something that's structuring the learning. The facilitator can actually play lots of different roles in the industry version of this, but we think of the facilitator as almost like a discussion facilitator. And in our study, this facilitator role is played by a conversational agent who's structuring the task. And the roles rotate, just like in pair programming, in order to give every student the opportunity to see the process from different perspectives. And the roles together are meant to make it the case that it's never on completely one person's shoulders to push forward the work. So there's a clear division of responsibilities. The goal is to prevent cognitive overload. It's, in a way, a kind of intersubjective process to participate in a team like this. And students are meant to have the opportunity to learn from others because of the discussion that goes on between the students in the different roles. And it discourages students from gravitating towards roles where they would do work that they're already good at because the rotation and assignment is not up to them. It's directed by the paradigm. So we evaluated this in a 3x3 Latin square design where we have 3 different tasks and 3 different conditions. We have transactivity-based teams, random teams, and individuals. But everyone in a team is using the mob programming paradigm. What we found was that if we look at what's happening within the groups, that the extent to which the teams conform to the expectations of the paradigm was associated with increased levels of task-relevant content in the discussion. So it seemed to elicit reflection from them, and we see that students. Let's just not go there. Okay. What we didn't see was that that the transactivity assignment actually increased the extent to which students engaged in this kind of reflection or conformed to the mob programming paradigm. So the paradigm itself was the strongest agent for improving group processes and outcomes in this particular context. And there was a lot more analysis there, but we'll leave it at this for the purposes of this talk and conclude with this idea that what we saw in Miao Wen's work was evidence that transactivity can be the basis for effective team formation. And in fact, in her work, she developed an automated paradigm that was effective in a MOOC. It can be used very large scale and had a positive effect. But what we do see is that there can be contextual factors that challenge whether, when applying a paradigm that has some validation, you actually see those positive effects in practice. And also, the team assignment we see as an implicit form of support for teams, and that if there's explicit support for teams that's strong enough, that it might not matter as much how you actually assign students to teams. And so that might be something to consider, especially for this symposium, where the topic itself is about team formation.